Hello and welcome to another episode of the How to Create VR tutorial series, where you learn by watching other VR, AR, and MR professionals create the magic. I'm Marcelo Lewin, an immersive technologies evangelist, creator, producer, and the guy behind howtocreatevr.com. My guest creator today is Gabe Baker, a former humanities teacher and education researcher who now works as head of education at WorldViz. Today, Gabe will show us how to use Vizible to create collaborative VR experiences. But before we get started, if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and please remember to subscribe to my channel. It will only take you a second, but the more subscribers I have, the easier it will be for me to get guests. Well, welcome to the tutorial series, Gabe. I'm glad you're here with us.
I'm happy to be here.
Today, you're going to be showing us the app called Vizible, right? Am I pronouncing it right?
That's correct, Vizible.
And we're going to talk about how to create collaborative experiences in VR, which is pretty cool. Before we do that, why don't you give us a little bit of your background?
Sure. So as you noted, I'm a former teacher. I used to teach history and Latin of all things down in Los Angeles. Went on to go back to school, got my master's in education technology, and specifically got interested in how teachers and students were leveraging 3D worlds for online distance learning and distance collaboration. After that, I kind of stayed in the virtual reality space, mostly focusing on education, but more recently also branching out into enterprise collaboration and leveraging virtual reality for things like sales and marketing over at WorldViz.
And how did you get into actual VR?
Well, I think it was for my graduate research. At the time, it was mostly revolved around Second Life, which although at the time wasn't VR, I know that Sansar got me just kind of very interested conceptually in the idea of 3D worlds, even when it was sort of screen-based. So as soon as things kind of shifted to VR in the industry, it was kind of a natural shift for me. My earliest venture here was with the education technology startup Adorable, where we really set out to make a collaborative 3D world specifically designed for the needs of teachers and students. So since then, I've stayed in VR. I'm a big believer in the technology and the way it can impact a variety of professionals, including, of course, teachers and students.
What's your favorite VR experience?
You know, I love some of the simple things that I think they've nailed really beautifully. Things like Google Earth. I also really enjoy some games. Superhot is one of my favorites. And then I'm also really interested in some web VR stuff, some new kind of browser-based experiences. I think there's one called A Painter from Mozilla, which is kind of like a tilt brush, but it's kind of embedded right inside of a web browser. And I'm always kind of astounded at how powerful that is, despite just being kind of web VR technology.
Yeah, definitely. Superhot VR is totally a classic. Everybody needs to try that out.
I agree.
Very cool. So today you're going to show us how to create a world inside your VR app, Vizible, right? And real quick, Vizible allows you to create VR worlds and collaborate in them. I mean, what's the use cases for Vizible? Can you give me just a quick overview of that?
Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. It's a way for sort of non-technical users to quickly create VR experiences. We call them sometimes presentations. We know that they're not like PowerPoints, but in some ways the user interface preserves some aspect of PowerPoint in that it's kind of a slide or scene-based creation tool. And then, as you mentioned as well, one of the things that's neat about Vizible is that out of the box, you can kind of publish your VR experiences as collaborative ones. So what I'll be doing is I'll be cooking up a simple scene, just showing you the different kinds of things you can bring into Vizible. Also adding some interactivity with some buttons, all of this without coding. And then finally, I'll publish it as a session, which means that you and I, or anyone else in the world, they had the session ID, could then hop into VR to kind of experience it together. And then I'll play the role of the host, kind of guiding you through the presentation as if we were going through something like a PowerPoint presentation, but we'll be in VR and I'll be taking you through the scenes that I've created in this demo.
Fantastic. And you're going to be using some assets which you provided to me, which people will be able to download later. I'll publish a link to them so people will be able to get them. So with that said, let's get started. Let's check this out.
Okay, sounds great. So when you first open up Vizible, you're taken to a screen where you can see the different VR experiences that you have cooked up. And you also have down here, this bottom tab, your asset library. And this is where you can drag in the building blocks of your VR experiences. These can be 3D models, 360 photos, but also more traditional stuff like documents, PDFs, flat videos, and sounds. And it's worth noting that with Vizible, you can do collaborative VR creation. So on your Vizible web dashboard, and we don't need to look at this now, but you can invite users to your Vizible organization. That's why each of these presentations, you'll see a little drop down for share permissions. And you can choose whether you want others in your organization to be able to edit any particular VR experience or use it to host multi-user experiences. And also this asset library will be shared with everyone in your Vizible organization. So it kind of gives you a shared repository of assets for you and others in your organization to work with.
Quick question on that. Is there a limit to the number of people you can share it with?
No, right now you can have as many people as you want in your Vizible organization. So yeah, there's no cap on that.
I see. And can you also adjust the permission level? So if I want to share with you to be able to view only or to edit but not create, can you do that? Or is it basically I share or not share?
Yeah, so you have some granularity there on the experiences themselves. You can choose to share or just kind of keep it private so that only you see it on this launcher screen or others in your org. At this point, the assets are kind of, once they're there, they're shared. There's no way to adjust the privacy of a particular asset. I suspect this might come in the future, but for now, if you upload an asset, everyone in your org will be able to make use of it as they build their own VR experiences.
And if they delete the asset, then obviously it's gone for everybody.
That is true.
Okay, yeah. Cool. All right, thank you.
So for us, what we're going to do, we're just going to go from scratch, kind of creating a simple scene so that you can really see what it's like just going from nothing and building up a basic scene. So for this, we're going to go up to this tab at the top for new scenes. Now, you'll see a few scenes here already. These are called our template scenes. And if you're just looking for a scene to kind of very quickly get started, you're welcome to open one of these up. You can sort of see how we put it together and sort of deconstruct it. But for the purpose of this demo, we're just going to go ahead and make a blank scene. So you can select blank scene, give it a name, say how to create VR demo, give it a description, simple scene with car engines. Go ahead and create it. Okay, it will load up, and this might be a good opportunity to just go over the overall kind of user interface and how these different windows are set up. So this is our default view. You can indeed rearrange these windows however you like. So here I'm kind of dragging this asset library. You see I can reposition it to either side. But this is our sort of default view. We think it does a pretty good job for kind of general purpose use. So we'll stick with this for now.
Question, can you create different workspaces and save them, or you just rearrange it and that's it? And then if you change your mind, can you reset to the default view?
So right now you can't save out different sort of views, but it will preserve the last view that you had on any presentation. So if you were to rearrange it to a view that you like, close out this scene and then make a new one, it would open up to your last preserved arrangement, but there's no way right now to kind of save out separate sort of workspaces.
Got it. And can you reset it to the default view if you change your mind?
I do believe that you can. Offhand, I don't know exactly where to find that button, but I do think that's a thing. I'll follow up with you after this to give you more details on that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so down here at the bottom, you'll see this is kind of an embedded view of that asset library I showed you earlier. And again, these are the building blocks of these presentations. And if you wanted to add an asset to this library, you could also just do it right from this screen. So if you had a folder, you could just literally just drag and drop. In this case, I'll pull in this image. We'll drop it right into your library here. You'll see it load up. Everything is kind of synced and saved to the cloud, kind of live as you're building. And then once it shows up in here, then you're able to drag and drop it into your scene itself. But I'm going to remove this for now. I just want to make sure we cover the rest of the sections before we begin building. Over here on the left, we have our what we call the slide view. So right now you see we just have one slide because we're sort of on just slide one. We haven't built anything beyond that. When our presentation gets a bit more expansive, we can make new slides. Now, of course, these aren't slides in the kind of traditional sense. A PowerPoint slide, of course, is just a kind of a 2D image. A slide in the context of Vizible is a 3D scene, kind of a blank canvas in which you can drag your assets and arrange them as you want. Then when you're actually inside of your Vizible experience with others, you as the presenter can navigate through these slides with a slide clicker tool. And you don't need to go through them in a linear way either, kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As you'll see later in this demo, there are ways you can set up buttons to kind of automatically transport people to slide 5, even if you started out on slide 1.
Can you duplicate slides like you do in PowerPoint where you get every item and asset that's in the previous slide come forward to the next slide?
Yep, you absolutely can. And to do this, you can just right-click on a slide and then press duplicate. And this is very handy because often I'm not changing everything about a slide. When I'm making a new scene, I actually sometimes want to preserve the overall environment that a scene is in, but maybe on the next slide, I just want to bring in additional things on top of that. And that duplicate slide feature is very handy for that. So you don't need to kind of recreate the wheel for each scene. You can keep what you want, whether it's a background environment or what have you, but then sort of build on top of it progressively.
And it comes with the interactions and everything else you added in the previous slide.
Yep, that's right.
Okay, cool. And I know this may not be set up yet, but are there like templates that, you know how in PowerPoint you have master templates that you can set up and then you apply like the background and all that? Do you guys have the concept of that yet on this or no?
So we don't have those that you can kind of quickly spin up now, but that's a really interesting idea. I think the closest thing to that is probably those template scenes that you can just start with. You can spring up from the launcher window.
Right.
But I love that idea, and I'll be thinking on that.
Cool. Sounds good.
Okay, great. So this is that slide view. So we've gone over down here, quick review, the asset library. Over here, we've got our slide view where you set up your different scenes. Over here on the right, this is where you can see a list of all of the assets currently in your presentation. So right now, there's not much here. There's just this scene object that is sort of a default asset in any Vizible presentation. You always have a scene. But as soon as we go about kind of adding more assets to this, so I just dragged in this image, you'll see the image sort of appears here as well. And whenever you want to select an asset, you can either click on it in the scene view, or you can select it right from here in this kind of asset graph. As scenes get crowded and busy, especially with kind of smaller things, sometimes it's just easier to select assets from here where you can clearly see their name. And then as soon as you select an asset, you'll see different properties down below, things like position, whether it's visible. And you can add other properties to this by right-clicking on the asset and looking at the different actions that you can set. And we'll go over these in more detail later. But long story short, you can select an asset either here in the scene view or up here, and then adjust its properties right below when you have the asset selected. This brings us to, of course, the scene view itself, which is kind of front and center here. This will look familiar to anyone who's played around a bit with Unity or really most kind of 3D editing tools. You have this kind of 3D canvas spread out, of course, on kind of X, Y, and Z axes. Moving the camera around is the kind of thing that takes a bit of learning initially, but once you know it, you'll be kind of zipping along with it. The three basic sort of features, though, are click and drag with the left mouse, click and drag to rotate the camera, click and drag with the right mouse button to pan the camera. So here I am panning it kind of left and right and up and down. And then you can use the scroll wheel or your trackpad to zoom the camera in or out. What I just did there was I had the asset selected and I pressed F. That's a neat trick to automatically focus the camera on a particular asset. So I think I press F maybe more than any other key in Vizible when I'm building, just because it's so handy. Sometimes you get zoomed out, things have different scales, but as soon as I want to kind of get up close with an asset, I'll select it, just press F, and you'll be zoomed right into it. Just as with Unity or another editor, you have tools that let you manipulate these assets in space. So you have things like, by default, selected is the positional transform tool. These kind of three arrows where you can adjust the position here. You'll also see as I'm doing this, the position property is updating over here on this right menu. And if you want, you can also adjust these properties manually, right? If you know you want the Y value to be 2, for example, you can just input 2 here in the Y menu. But I often prefer just to kind of move things around sort of manually, but it just depends on your use case. You can also select the rotate button up here. And again, these are all just up at the top left. So once you have rotate selected, you can rotate an asset on all of its axes. And this holds for all asset types, right? You can do this with, I'm doing it here with an image, but it's the same if you're doing it with a 3D model or a video. It really works the same way. So here you see I just dragged in a model of an HTC Vive. You can do those things that we were just doing with the image, but just with the 3D model. And then, of course, you have scale. And you can scale up assets either on one of its axes. If you just want to make something bigger along the Y, you can scale it up this way. Because of the way this image is scaled, it's not actually moving along with me. But then to scale it proportionally, you can drag it from this middle sort of circle, and that'll scale it up along all axes sort of proportionally so that it maintains the ratio that you had originally. Okay, to remove an asset from the scene, I'm going to kind of clear this away because we're going to actually start creating the scene we're going to build in this demo. You can right-click on it and then select Remove Component. Now, worth noting, this just removes it from your presentation. This doesn't delete it from your asset library. If you wanted to actually fully remove it from the asset library, you could right-click on it and then select Delete. Be wary of this, though. As you noticed earlier, if you were to do this, that would remove the asset for everyone in your organization. So you want to make sure that no one else is using that asset. I often just leave things in just to be safe, to make sure I'm not deleting anyone else's asset.
Quick question on that. If you delete the asset, is the asset attached to the scene? In other words, will it disappear from the scene? Or if you delete it from the assets panel, it'll still be in the scene, just nobody else will have access to it afterwards?
If you actually remove it from the asset library, but you haven't removed it from your scene, I'm not sure what happens. I'm fairly sure that just when you leave your presentation and come back into it, that asset
will be gone.
Won't be there. I think it sort of just preserves a little image of it,
right? Not
knowing what to do with it in the meantime.
So like a link to it. Yep. Okay. Yeah, so right. You have to be real careful not to do that then. And it won't warn you that, hey, you're using it in other places, which would be hard to track. Okay. And then another question on the assets library itself. Is the assets library attached to the project like this one we're doing, or is it attached to your account? Meaning that this asset library, when you create a new project, you'll see the same, all the assets.
Yeah, that's right. So you'll see the same asset library no matter what project you're working on. So the asset library isn't linked to any particular presentation. It's really just linked to your Vizible organization as a whole. So if we were to close this scene, open up a new scene, you'd have all these assets available to you to use. The big difference would just be you wouldn't have them yet, brought into the scene, so you wouldn't see anything here in the asset.
But you'll see all of them, and you can organize them. It says I see type filter, so I guess you can filter those up. So if you have 500 absolutely. Assets, you can filter them.
That's right. So we're working on different ways to sort of organize this, but in the meantime, there is a very handy sort of type filter. So if you know that you just want to see your models, for example, in your library, you can filter by model. There are even subtypes for certain asset types. So if we just wanted to find the 360 photos that we had, you could go to image. Here are all of the images, but then you can also filter by subtype, spherical or spherical 3D if you have a stereoscopic image.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
So these are very handy. And then when you're ready to kind of clear your asset filter, you can just hit this little X button over to the right, and that'll bring back the main view of your library. And of course, you can also just, if you know the name of it, you can go ahead and search it out, and that would be helpful too.
Perfect. Great.
So I'm going to go ahead and remove this Vive model.
I do have one last question. Well, I lied. It's not one last question. I have one more question. On the scene on the right-hand side under components, those are all your components in your scene. Can you rename everything? Can you rename your scene? So if you have 100 slides, can you say, hey, this is the entry scene, this is the whatever scene, but can you name them so that way you have a way of organizing that?
Yes, absolutely. So if you have an asset selected and you click on its name again, you'll see you can edit the name of it right here, just directly instead of just Vive. And then as to your question of can you rename the slides itself, you definitely can. So over here in the slide view, you can actually click up at the top to give the slide a name. So I'll say intro slide, whereas this slide 2, I'll say transition to our engines. And that will preserve the title of the slide. And then this becomes handy when you're actually in Vizible. You can kind of preview the slides to come. So kind of like how PowerPoint, you can kind of see that preview of the slides to come and the name of it and things like that. You can also do that in Vizible, and that's where these names come in handy.
Yeah.
So also worth noting while I'm over here, the thumbnail over here originally is just this kind of generic image, but if you want to set the thumbnail so that you have a better sense when you're getting a bird's eye view of your creation, what each scene actually has in it, you can hit this little camera button and it'll take a snapshot of the current view of the scene view. So if this is a good kind of representation, you think, of the slide overall, then just get the camera where you want it and click that little camera button, and you'll see that it populates that thumbnail with that image. So it's a handy way to kind of organize the slides using those thumbnails. Otherwise, it's just this kind of generic one, and that's not particularly helpful when you're trying to quickly glance and find the slide that you want.
Yeah, makes sense. Question also on the component graphs. I see the hierarchy is pretty much flat. Can you add something to the HTC Vive model and it'll be underneath that? So when you move or transform the Vive, it'll also transform the object that's attached to it? Or is it pretty much a flat hierarchy right now?
So that's a great question. This is a new feature of ours. And you can indeed do kind of basic asset parenting and things like that. You'll see a little button over here at the top left that if you click, it takes you to what's kind of called the advanced view. And it's just advanced in the sense that you can create these kind of hierarchies where you do parenting and things like that. So as soon as I click that, you'll see the Vive model kind of went under the scene. In some ways, everything is sort of a child of this overall scene asset. But to demonstrate the use case you just mentioned, for example, I'll go ahead and bring in another Vive, not particularly exciting, but just for the sake of demoing this feature. Go ahead and drag the one from the component graph. You can drag one onto the other one. You'll see it then kind of collapse under the parent model. And then as soon as you move I guess this one's the parent. As soon as you move the parent, you'll see it's also moving the child with it.
Yeah, perfect. Yep.
This works for all things. This also applies in the Vizible experience itself. So if you right-click on an asset and you've made it grabbable, if someone in the Vizible experience were to reach out and grab this one and move it around, it would also move any child entity attached to it.
Perfect.
That's an important one, actually, that grabbable feature. You can just access that again, kind of right-click on any asset, and you'll see an option to make it grabbable. Now, what grabbable means in VR is pretty common sense. You kind of reach out with your controller and you hold the trigger and you grab it. On desktop mode, you can indeed still grab. You kind of use your mouse to move a controller around, and then you can click to grab any object that's set to grabbable. I'm going to go ahead and now clear out these Vives. So to start off this scene and to step back for a second, what I'm going to make is a simple presentation here that just makes use of a few different asset types so that you can see the different kinds of things you can bring into Vizible. And the sort of use case is kind of making a simple presentation. So I'm kind of working from the perspective of a salesperson at a company selling car engines. So I want to make a brief few slides that have some 3D models of car engines, maybe a video that shows the process on the factory floor, and a few other odds and ends to wrap it up. As I said before, one of our big goals with Vizible is to really help kind of the non-technical user create compelling VR experiences pretty quickly. So it's not the kind of thing where you're kind of digging in with Unity in a project that might take 2 or 3 weeks to build. This is more the kind of thing where you have an idea, you have maybe 9 or 10 different assets, and you want to be able to cook something up in 20, 30 minutes. So I'm going to start out on scene slide 1 here. And the first asset I'm going to bring in, and again, these are going to be made available to you for download, I'm going to bring in this modern lobby. This is sort of a popular WorldViz home base here. See, I brought in the model. I loaded up just fine. Now I'm just rotating my camera around. See, I actually just rotated the axis of the model itself. That's not what I wanted to do. I can just adjust that over here in the set rotation. Just going to zero it back out so it's nice and flat. So there's our lobby. You see it also has this grid on the bottom. The grid is not part of the lobby. It's part of the editor. You can toggle it on or off up here. There's a button for grid. So I'm going to go ahead and toggle it off to keep my view nice and clean. Now that I have this view, I can update my slide thumbnail. See, it's stuck on the Vive before. I'm just going to hit that camera button. Okay, that looks better. So what I want to do next is set the viewpoint of those that join the session. So this is how you kind of set the original position of those that join your presentation, and also you yourself as the host or facilitator of the meeting. So there are 2 assets for this, and you'll always see these in your asset library. They're kind of like core Vizible assets. One of them is called the presenter stand-in, and the other one is called the attendee stand-in. So I'm going to go ahead and drag in the presenter stand-in, and I'm going to rotate the stand-in, so I'm kind of facing this way. And then I'm going to go ahead and bring in the attendee stand-in. Now, when you attend a session, right, so if you were the presenter, this is where you would spawn. You just want to make sure you right-click on these stand-ins and select Reset Viewpoint, and that will ensure that this kind of becomes the spawn point for this particular slide or scene. And you can adjust these on a per-slide basis. So let's just say, for example, you want to have another slide where you simply have people, instead of spawning right here in the middle, maybe they spawn over here in the corner by these sofas. All I did there was just duplicated the first slide and then moved the stand-in. So instead of the stand-in being at the middle, I can move this stand-in over here. And this really is handy because sometimes these virtual environments are large, and people's tracking environments simply might not be this big to allow someone to, say, walk from the middle of this room over here to the sofas. So you can use these tricks with stand-ins to kind of quickly transport people around a larger space and adjust their viewpoint without forcing them to do that movement on their own. So I've got my presenter stand-in and I've got my attendee stand-in. And for each of them, I want to make sure I select that reset viewpoint, just make sure that becomes the starting point. I like to do this arrangement early on so that when people spawn in, they're generally just facing each other. It makes things less confusing and a little bit more personable. So I know that when someone joins up, they'll be oriented this way and hopefully looking at me because I will have already joined as the presenter. There are a few other things you can do with these stand-ins that are very cool. So if you right-click on a stand-in, you'll see a number of options. You have another handy one is default tool. So we'll get into the tools later when we're actually in Vizible, but you can enable a number of tools on your controller when you're in a Vizible session. These things can be laser pointers, pencils, the grabber tool, which you have to have enabled to grab an object and other things. And sometimes rather than forcing users to, pull up the menu and pick the tool, if you know that attendees should have a particular tool enabled, you can just give them a default tool. So let's say you want them to have the grabber already turned on slide 1, just go ahead and select grabber as the default tool. If you know that you, as the presenter, you really want to have the laser pointer already turned on so that you don't need to fuss with the menu, just go ahead and select laser pointer as the default tool. And again, just as with the position of these stand-ins, you can also adjust this default tool property on a per slide basis. So if you know on slide 2, now you know that you really want to have a different tool kind of already enabled, just go ahead and adjust that property here. Maybe here you'll have the pencil already turned on. And then automatically, in the context of your Vizible session, when you move from slide 1 to slide 2, the tool you already have turned on, it'll move from the laser pointer over to the pencil. So it's very handy. And you can even go one step further. This is particularly handy if you know that you don't want people to even be able to access the menu. And this isn't just to be a control freak, but sometimes just to reduce the amount of distractions in a session. Pulling up the menu is fun. It gives you all these things to explore. But if you actually really want to have people's attention focused on whatever it is you're talking about or showing them in that scene, sometimes you might just want to lock their menu. They'll still have access to the default tool if you've set one up, maybe the grabber. It just means that they won't be able to change what tool they have turned on. So you have a little bit of control over there in terms of the tooling, what's turned on by default. And again, you can change all of these on a per slide basis. So we've got our stand-ins in. We're going to go ahead and fill out the presentation with kind of the meat of the creation, right? Kind of these assets. So first what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring in a car engine 3D model. So this is already in our asset library. I'm going to go ahead and drag this in. And it loads up. You'll see that it's scaled up way too big. And to fix this, we can just pull up the scale tool. I'm going to go ahead and scale it down so it's a bit more manageable. Okay. Now, for this experience, I'm sort of imagining, you start out on slide 1, and I just want you to be in the lobby. So, in fact, really fast, I'm going to remove this, but just duplicate this slide so that on slide 2, when you move to it, the car engine model will appear. So rearrange here. Okay, perfect. So I'm on slide 2, and now on this slide, just have to scale this down again, very quick. On this slide, when you navigate to it, this car engine model will appear. It's a gorgeous model. We pulled this from Sketchfab. Looks like it was a photogrammetry scan, so generated with looks like a couple hundred photos. Because I want the people in my session to be able to grab this car engine model and interact with it, I'm going to go ahead and make it grabbable. Let's say you want to be fancy. Just like with PowerPoint, you can set up animations and things like this. Maybe you want the car engine to sort of come up from the depths of the floor slowly with a nice little animation. This kind of thing is very simple and visible without any scripting. I'm just going to bring the asset. I'm going to make its starting position down here below the floor. I'm going to right-click on it and give it a Move To property. Now the Move To, the Y value, I know instead of -1, it's going to be something more like +1. So I'm just going to put in 1. You can adjust how long the animation over which it takes place. So here it's 5 seconds, which is a good time. And then when it looks good, you're all set. And you can preview all the actions you've set up on a slide. If you just click out of it, going back to slide 1, and then back to slide 2, it'll give you a little preview of all those little actions and animations that you've set up.
That's pretty cool. So the starting position would be the set position, right? That's where it starts from.
That's exactly right. So starting position is set position, and then when you do a move to, that'll be the position where it ends up.
Very cool.
Notice also, we won't do all of these for the sake of time, but you can set scale to if you want an asset to scale up, rotate to, and also, as we saw before, move to. You can also do fade to, things like spin, and so forth. We've got the car engine in here. I'm going to take a quick snapshot of this slide so that the thumbnail is more helpful. And then I'm going to go ahead and again duplicate that slide. Okay. And on this slide, I'd also want just a little image to appear so that we can make sense of these different pieces in the car engine. I brought in a little schematic that helps people actually get some textual reference as to what the different pieces of the engine are. So I brought in this little image, nothing too fancy, but this kind of thing can be very helpful to supplement 3D material, help you make sense of it as a reference. Just as with the car engine, I'm going to go ahead and make this grabbable. Okay, nice. So now on slide 3, I'm going to take another little snapshot of it. Nice. So on the intro, we've got nothing, kind of neat and clean up and visible. As soon as you move to slide 2, the car engine will appear. Looks great. It's going to be grabbable. And then on slide 3, it doesn't make sense for the car engine to have this move to on this slide. So just on this slide, I'm going to hit the trash can by the move to. So it'll just adjust its set position manually here. It'll just appear here now.
So basically, at this point, we would have copied the move to X, Y, and Z to the set position, then remove the move to.
That's right. So when we copied slide 2, originally it preserved that animation. So on slide 3, I wanted to just get rid of it and instead changed its set position up here.
Okay, sounds good.
Exactly.
Yep.
Cool. Okay, nice. I want to make a new slide now. And on this one, I would like to now bring in a video. So I'm going to have the lobby as before. Perfect. And then on this slide, I'm going to bring in, actually, let's make it a 360 photo. So now you want to hop into the interior of the car, perhaps. You're doing kind of the full spectrum car kind of presentation. You've looked at the innards, got the car engine, got the image to help supplement that. But now you want to take a little quick journey into the car itself. So I brought in this 360 photo. Now the 360 photo, you have to make sure you tag it as such in the asset library. And then when you bring it in, you'll see that it appears kind of as this funky looking sphere. Now, when you're in Vizible itself, you can point the remote tool at a photosphere or a video sphere and then expand it out. But if you want to get a little preview of how it looks from within the context of Vizible Presentation Designer that we're using now, you can right-click on it and select Expand. You'll see the photo kind of expands out. You can rotate the mouse around to get a sense of the photo, see that it looks right, see that the stitching is done right. You can kind of zoom around. And if you want, when users navigate to this slide, if you want the photo to already be expanded, you can do that. You would just have it expanded out, as I just did, and then just leave it like that, expanded. What that means is that when users actually move to that slide, they'll kind of already be immersed in that photosphere. I generally don't do this. I prefer kind of manually expanding these out in the context of the presentation, just because I never know exactly when I want to expand it. Every conversation is different, and having that manual control is something that I prefer, but it just depends on what you're doing.
And you say it supports both video and photo, spherical.
That's right.
Okay.
And stereo or mono. So if you've captured it with an Insta360 Pro or some other camera that does that kind of 3D photo taking, you can bring those in as well, and they look gorgeous. Any questions on photospheres, video spheres here in Vizible?
No questions, Gabe. You can continue.
Okay, perfect. To show another sort of asset type, not as fancy, but still very functional, I'm going to bring in just a regular flat 2D video. So for this, I'm going to drag in, this is an MP4 file. So our video imported, I'm going to go ahead and drag this into the scene. Now, you can make these videos automatically be playing when you hit this slide, in which case just right-click on the video and turn on this Start Playing property. You'll see it there. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off, though, because we don't need it. You can manually play it within Vizible itself. Now, I want to show you another very important feature. So beyond just looking at stuff in Vizible, you can also set up buttons and different kinds of interactivity so that the presentation is kind of responsive to user behavior and input. So to do this, you drag in either a proximity sensor or a time sensor if you know you want an action to happen after a certain amount of time has gone by, you can use a time sensor. But for this demo, we're just going to adjust a simple little proximity sensor. When you bring a sensor in, it comes in as this funky looking sci-fi thing. But if you right click on it, you can adjust its shape. So I'm going to give it a set shape, make it a smaller sphere. I'm going to put it around here. The target is going to be hands because I want people to be able to click this with their VR controller just when their hand is inside the sphere area. And then you have a few different triggers. You can do inside button release, which is a typical button click, or you can do enter proximity. If you want the proximity sensor to go off just when users move their hand into this area, you can do enter proximity. And just with any other asset, you could make this as big or as small as you want. So if you wanted something to happen as soon as users crossed this threshold halfway through the room, you could extend this all the way out. You can also then hide it so that it's actually not visible to attendees, even though it's still active.
Can you use proximity sensors to send you to a next scene?
You definitely can. And in fact, I'll go ahead and set that up right now because that's a very sort of good use case for these. So to do this, what you would do, we're on slide 4. I'm going to make this button, because we don't have slides after it, I'm just going to make this a button that takes us back home, back to slide 1. So to do this, I'm going to go ahead and right-click. The trigger that I want is inside button release. As soon as you click this, you'll see the sensor goes green. This means you're in this mode where you are setting what will happen when the sensor goes off. Now in this case, we want to move our whole scene back to slide 1. So we select the scene object, and you can right-click on it, and you'll see the available actions you can set. In this case, we want a set slide. So I'm going to click set slide. You'll see this property appear, and you can just select an integer, the slide number that you want this then to move to. In this case, we do want integer 1. It's just going to take us back to slide 1. When things look good and your sensor is all set up, right-click on it again and select Exit Active Trigger, and you'll be taken back to your main kind of regular editing mode. There are all sorts of things that you can set up with these sensors before we set up a move to on a car engine. But if we wanted that move to be triggered from a proximity sensor, it'd be very simple. So I'll link another action to the same sensor. So I'm going to do a switch to trigger, inside button release. And let's say you want this photosphere to scale up on that button press. Well, I'd right-click on the photosphere, and I would give it a scale 2, and then just adjust accordingly. I'm going to change it from 0.3, 0.3, 0.3 to 0.6, 0.6, 0.6. And you'll see the photosphere is scaling up along with this. The time for the animation is 5 seconds. That looks good to me. And if that all looks good, then just as before, right-click on your sensor, exit active trigger. You'll see the photosphere goes back to its original position, and you're back in your regular editing mode. If you want a preview of everything you've set up on a sensor, just select that trigger, and it'll show you everything you have linked to it. That's why the photosphere is now scaling up. If that looks good to you again, go ahead and exit active trigger, and then you are all set. So this presentation, it's very simple, but just for the sake of the demo, let's say that it was all wrapped up, everything looked good to you, and you're ready to meet with others in VR inside your presentation. So to do this, down at the bottom, next to the Assets tab, you'll see a Sessions tab. And in the Sessions tab, you'll see a plus button. This launches a little modal. It's kind of like a GoToMeeting scheduling modal. You select the time of your session. It'll default to right now and give it a date. And you can also select when you want the assets to be available to attendees to download in advance so that they can kind of pre-download the assets. You can give it a title and a description. And when it's done, just press Add Session. Then in your Sessions window, you'll see your session appear with a session ID. Now, if someone has Vizible and they know the ropes, you can just copy and paste the session ID to them. But if they're kind of new to Vizible, this might be their first time using it, you can right-click on the session. You'll see Copy Invitation Text. And when you paste that into an email and send someone, it kind of creates a full-on invitation. It says, here's a link to download Vizible, here's your session ID, and here are some hardware configuration settings so that they'll be kind of off to the races just with that invitation.
So all this is really cool. I have a question. I see that you have an editing session. Does that mean that you can invite somebody into this session while you're editing?
So the editing session is a session that you can always open up sort of locally. Someone else could open it too. And the editing session is just unique from other sessions in that while you have someone in it, as you make changes here in Presentation Designer, those changes will be reflected live in the editing session. So it's very handy. For example, if you have two people, maybe one of them is working on the presentation, it can be hard sometimes to really tell how something looks in VR. So you can have someone else in the headset in the editing session, and then while you're actually adjusting things here, based on their guidance, they might be saying, oh, move this to the right, to the left, based on their view in VR. Then you can actually make those changes that they'll see reflected live. So the editing session is kind of always a session that you can use to see how your presentation looks in VR as you're building it. There's actually a little button up here, up at the top right, that just gives you a one click to sort of launch the current editing session. Once you do that, you select your VR device, whether it's desktop, Vive, Rift, WinMR, and then you're off to the races.
And then you'd be in there as a presenter, but if you give the ID to somebody else, they'll be in there as a attendant?
That's right.
I see.
So, and especially when you're having a full-on session. So when you give this ID to someone, you have to first log into a session as a presenter. It'll ask for your login credentials, and then you're good to go. Attendees don't even need a Vizible account. They can just open up the attendee client, put in a session ID, and then they're good to go. And they'll join as attendees, as you said.
Very cool. Maybe for future upgrades, the attendee in the editing session could just grab that video and move it to the left and say, no, I think it looks better here in VR. That would be kind of cool.
That would be very cool.
Who knows? Maybe version 2.0.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, cool. So we're pretty much out of time, to be honest, but let's do the publish. So how do we publish? And then after the publish, people would then just take the session, open up the viewer, put on their HMD, and they're in there.
That's exactly right. So once you've made a session, and again, just to that is kind of the publishing process, is sort of generating those sessions. So you make your session, you schedule it as you want. The session will appear. You invite others via the invitation text or just the session ID. And then when all is said and done, you open up Vizible Presenter. If you're the presenter, you put in the session ID, and then you're good. Attendees will open up Vizible Attendee. They'll put in the ID, and then they'll be good as well. Your presentation, if you were to close out of this, you can access it again. They'll be published kind of to your scene launcher here. So now in my scene, you'll see I've got the presentation we just made, how to create VR demo. If you want to make sure others in your Vizible organization can see this and even edit it, just make sure the share permissions are on full. One quick feature I want to draw attention to is you can have multiple people working on the same presentation at the same time. It's kind of like a live Google Doc, and that's just that little green icon you see up on slide 1, the GA. It's just letting you know that's me. I'm currently working on slide 2, but you could have 5 other people with Presentation Designer open working on this presentation, and you'll see everyone's changes kind of reflected in real time.
That's pretty cool.
So it's a very powerful way to kind of collaboratively work on VR experiences.
Totally. So the publishing process, you said, is just you create a session, and the session when the scheduled ends and they go to that, it just says, sorry, presentation is closed. That's
right. You can make the sessions quite long. So if you know that you want to have just a window where it's sort of available for people to come in, you can definitely, the sessions can be 8 hours long. So there's no real way to kind of permanently publish it so that it's always accessible, although this is something we're definitely thinking about. But for now, you can at least publish these sessions so that they're quite long and sort of accessible for a long window of time.
Right. And then how many attendees can join?
So right now, we sort of say we officially support around 4 or 5. I will say I've seen Vizible meetings with more like 9 or 10. It just depends then on people's kind of connectivity. But I've actually seen very low latency interactions with 9 people in Vizible at once. This is, again, something we're kind of actively working on. So for now, I'd say to play it safe, around 4 or 5. But to push it, I've seen it work just fine with 8, 9, or 10.
I see. So this is really for small meetings and not for large events or anything like that. Because immediately what came to mind was like, wow, we can create an online expo and have people attend.
So all I can say at this point is this is something we're definitely thinking about. We really prioritize kind of performance before making those leaps. So for us, if we're going to do that, we just want to make sure that we do it right and in such a way that kind of preserves the quality and fidelity of the experience.
Yep, definitely. Gabe, this was really, really cool. I'm actually very impressed with this app. I just love the fact that you can create like in PowerPoint, but it's VR. So that's pretty cool. Real quick, because we're pretty much out of time. The business model, in other words, what's the cost of this? And we don't need to go into specific exactly how much it costs, because by the time people watch it and a year from now may be different, but do you charge per user? How does that work?
So the way it works is we charge per number of kind of presentation designer user. So it's not charged based on the number of attendees in the space. The charge more revolves around the number of presenters you have in your organization actually creating presentations. I will say, though, we are actually kind of discussing the pricing model now. So I do think this is something that very much might be different a month or 2 or 3 down the line. And also worth noting that if you are an educator or a trainer, we offer very steep discounts for those looking for kind of an educational sort of license.
I see.
So I encourage you to inquire with me about that. I'm the head of education at WorldViz, and that's the kind of thing that I work with people to get them set up with Vizible.
Perfect. And for now, it's basically if you're a presenter or a creator, not a presenter, but a creator, then you get charged for that one creator. So if you have one creator, you can create as many presentations as you want and have 4 or 5 attendees, and it doesn't matter. The key is for now, at least. Things may change. Yeah.
That's right.
Okay. Perfect. Wow, Gabe, very impressive. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, definitely a lot of fun. I can't wait to play with it myself, actually.
I look forward to seeing what you cook up.
Oh, yeah, I'll put it out there. If people want to get a hold of you or get a hold of Vizible, what do you recommend? URL, Twitter, your email, whatever you want.
Sure. So feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm just Baker at worldviz.com. I'm also on Twitter, where I tweet about Vizible, WorldViz, and all things VR at Gabriel J. Baker. To download Vizible, you can simply go to worldviz.com. It's the main call to action there is Explore Vizible. Right from that page, you'll see a download button immediately that'll help you download and get started for free. So feel free to use that or worldviz.com/Vizible.
So there's no charge for people to create and just watch locally by themselves. That because you said they can start for free.
So the start for free, and again, this is something we're kind of chatting about right now, but the start for free right now, it gives you a 30-day free trial that gives you full access to every sort of feature under the sun. And then from there, if you want to continue creating and holding sessions, then you'll have to adopt a plan.
Got it. Okay, perfect. All right. Well, Gabe, thank you so much. And to the rest of you, I'm glad you were here with us. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and remember to click on the subscribe button so that I can get more guests for this tutorial series. If you are ever in the Southern California area, we have a monthly meetup with lots of great VR, AR, and MR presentations. You can join or RSVP for our next meetup at howtocreatevr.com/meetup. Finally, if you're interested in learning more about how to create VR, AR, and MR experiences, please visit howtocreatevr.com. So until the next episode, I'm Marcelo Lewin. Cheers, everyone.